morning. Welcome back to UI class. Today's topic is about global inflation. So I think, right, in recent months, we have heard a lot of news reports about a rapid increase in inflation rate everywhere. The US has just reported that latest inflation rate in October 2021 climbed to 6.8%, which broke the 40 years record since June 1982. And also the Federal Reserve Board announced that there will be at least 3 interest rate hikes in the coming year, 2022. So it becomes a very hot topic about inflation rate in the world. Well, interestingly, the inflation rate of Hong Kong is relatively low in recent months. So this article is trying to explain why the inflation rate of Hong Kong can keep low. So let's review the history first. In the 1970s to 1980s, there was a period of great inflation, especially in the US. And in 1980, the inflation rate peaked at almost 14%. And I think, the elderly must remember that in the old days, we had double-digit interest rate and inflation rate. And so currently, when the US inflation rate is 6.8%, even though it is breaking the 40 years record high, but in comparison with the great inflation period, it is still relatively modest. So then let me show you some of the developed countries in the period after the outbreak of the pandemic on their inflation rate. So we are now having a kind of supply push inflation. That is, in the beginning of the outbreak of the pandemic, the economy was hard hit, and so we had a period of economic recession, and some countries even had a period of deflation. But then the central banks of many countries had concerted actions to reduce their interest rate to historic lows, and therefore the economic recessions was turned into economic growth, and also inflation is resulted. Worse still, during this period of money supply and quantity easing, then the pandemic continues, and so we have a breaking supply chain in the world. So container ports are mostly congested, and we even do not have enough containers. So that's why it triggers a kind of supply side push inflation. So first of all, this chart shows you the PPI, the production price index of Canada, Germany, France, UK, and the US. And you will find that the US and Canada in particular had a very rapid increase in PPI after mid-2020. And so they have the corresponding hikes in CPI year-on-year change. That's what we defined inflation rate. So here the 2 blue lines refers to the US and Canada, which show a similar pattern as their PPI chart. And so this seems to confirm that the recent inflation is driven by the supply push. So it can result in stagflation. So it is very complicated and difficult situations. The central bank will have a dilemma because of stagflation. we cannot keep interest rate low, but also we could not increase interest rate too much. So then, comparatively, the inflation rate in Hong Kong is relatively low. Indeed, in the second half of 2020, Hong Kong even encountered a long period of deflation. So here the chart shows you that even in October 2021, the inflation rate of Hong Kong is just 1.7%. And so this article is going to ask the questions why Hong Kong would have a relatively low inflation rate in 2021 when the developed world is facing a severe inflation. In order to understand about inflation rate, we have to understand about the definition of inflation rate first. So inflation rate is the year-on-year change of consumer price index, CPI. Well, CPI is a measure of the price of a basket of goods and services. Then in Hong Kong, the basket of goods and services is subdivided into 9 categories, and there are hundreds of goods and services to be measured every month. So here the chart provided by the Census and Statistics Department of Hong Kong government shows that they impose different expenditure weights on the 9 categories of the basket of goods and services for measuring CPI. Housing, in particular, accounts for almost 40% in expenditure weight, while other categories like transport accounts for only 6 to 7%, basic food accounts for only about 7 to 13%. Right. So the left bar refers to the composite CPI, while the second one, Class A, and next Class B and Class C. So that's the reason why, even if food price has been increasing substantially, but it does not seem to be reflected in the inflation rate, while housing rent will largely determine the pattern of inflation rate. That is because of the overwhelmingly dominant expenditure weightings of housing in the 9 categories of measuring CPI. So let me illustrate by the following 2 examples. So the first one is about pork price. So here the chart shows you the meat price indices in Hong Kong. Since 2019, pork prices have been doubled, while other meat are increasing moderately. But even though the price of pork had increased 100%, but since it is classified under the basic food category, and there are more than 26 items within this basic food category, and basic food category only accounts for 10.36% of the total expenditure weights, while pork will only account for a net expenditure weight of 1.35%. In other words, even a 100% increase in pork prices will only contribute to the inflation rate by less than 1.5%. But then, in contrast, let's take a look about what will be the effect of just 10% drop in housing rent. Here is the chart showing the housing rental index of Hong Kong in the private housing market and its annual growth rate. So in fact, before 2019, right? It has been increasing quite rapidly. Say, for example, in 2017, the growth rate has reached more than 10%. Well, until mid-2019, it starts to fall. So yeah, in mid-2020, it had fallen by about 10%. So referring to the Census and Statistics Department's explanations, the net weight of private rental housing is 35.46%. So in other words, just a 10% decrease in housing rents can cause the inflation rate to fall by 3.55%. So it shows how dominant that housing rent is on the measurement of inflation rates in Hong Kong. And here I would like to emphasize that housing price is not included in measuring inflation rate, and only housing rent will be regarded as a kind of consumer goods and services. Well, in reality, since most Hong Kong residents are not private housing tenants, so their perceptions of price increases of consumer goods and services may not be the same as the inflation figures released by the government. In this particular period, because of the lockdown, the pandemic, prices of many daily necessities have been soaring, and so most people are quite stressful by the sharp increase in their living expenses. But the government's release of the monthly inflation rate in October was only 1.7%. Unfortunately, employers would usually refer to the government's released inflation rates to determine the salary increase rate. And because of this difference, so the quality of life of employees, right, will be affected adversely by this kind of overweighting of housing rent in the measurement of consumer price index.